Welcome, snow queens and fiery preachers, to the blood-soaked wastes of Ea. Today we are continuing our series on the Crucible of Wills, Ashes and Faith, and in yesterday's video, or the last video, we left off after scenarios 1 and 2, which was interesting in my opinion, because they happened simultaneously. The Nords have the Veil Siege, our semi-living MacGuffin or plot device, but they aren't even out of the crypt city of Ipetra before they are intercepted. If you want the full details, go watch the previous two videos that set all of this up. But we've got a Jarl with the MacGuffin in the main army, and Rainleaf Faithbringer punching Firebrand Andronicus in his own throne room. And we're going to jump right into it. Now, one thing really quickly before I start the story, if you're interested in Conquest and want to support the channel, please consider using my affiliate link. You'll save 10% on all your Conquest purchases from Bellum, and every time you do at no cost to you, it throws a tip in my tip jar that supports me, my wife, our cats, and it means the absolute world to me. Now, regardless of how your battles in scenarios 1 and 2 end, the momentum of those battles will be spent, and both forces need to regroup a little bit. I mean, the Old Dominion, their forces aren't even fully awake yet. They're still mid-process, and the Nords, once Rainleaf slips out, it's a simple matter to kind of catch up to the rest of her army. For Gunnar One-Eye, the Jarl who has the Veil Siege with them, they basically slip out of the main gate and the whole Nord army kind of regroups just outside of Ipetra. As for the Old Dominion, they're having a tough time, right? The Veil Siege is slipping away from Andronicus, and his legions seem to be taking their precious time at rousing to war. Now, he's got access to a few troops. He's got a few Praetorians and the remnants of his gate guard. Ackless was one of the ones we mentioned before. He was the leader of that force. But one thing that the Old Dominion does have on their side is weariness, in that they do not experience it. Once Rainleaf and Gunnar reunite outside the gates of Ipetra, they need to breathe for a second. They and their forces are mortal. And having your army run and charge and fight and run some more really does take it out of them. So the Nord forces have to pause for a second to kind of regroup, recover, and then they can make their sprint to the finish line, which in this case is getting the Veil Siege back to the boats. Once that happens, then it's anyone's gambit of what they want to do, but that's the mission. It seems almost like the boats are almost like a day away, so that's longer than just a quick jaunt where you can do it in one quick sprint, so you do need to rest a smidge, but it's also not like days upon days away. And what all that means is Andronicus has a little bit of time, but it's fleeting. And so his plan at this point is to send an ambush force. We're going to harass the Nords, don't give them a moment's rest, basically just try and keep them pinned. They're too tired to run, so if we attack them, they're going to form up. And if we could just kind of keep them there, the longer we keep them there, the more of my forces are going to begin to, rise from the dead and go and get sent in. And we'll just attrition them away. So to kind of instigate this plan, he and Ackless go out there. They take his personal guard again, and on their way out towards the Nords, a regiment of bone golems known as the Ossuary Guard are awakened to join them. So now they got some heavy hitters, something with a little bit more impact than just praetors guarding the throne room. And the logic of Andronicus's plan is pretty straightforward, right? The army that he's amassed and is walking out the gates right now is not meant to kill the Nords. This is an act of attrition. Pin them down in battle, and over time will whittle their army away to nothing. They can't escape, and given time, we have the superior numbers, which is a fantastic plan. And so the idea is to ambush the Nords at rest, steal away that rest and relaxation from them, and make them continue to fight. If they can't breathe, they can't run. If they can't run, they can't take away the Veil Siege. Now that setup here that I just described is your prelude to Scenario 3, which seeks to recreate an ambush, and it essentially limits how many Nord units can start on the board, and lists the characters who are there and so on. And this is a part of where I mentioned before the reward for winning previous scenarios that really fit into the mission. If Rainleaf won the first blood game from Scenario 1, you get to start with more units on the table, meaning she pulled more of her forces out of the throne room. If the Old Dominion player won, 2 units get outflanked because they were able to rush out of the throne room faster. That kind of stuff. It's real neat. Nothing game-breaking, not like you get an extra 500 points or a free unit, just some minor rules to recreate the idea that those wins mattered, which I think is the goal for any kind of campaign play. Rewarding success without snowballing. Regardless, essentially at the end, the question that this game is about answering is, did Andronicus succeed at pinning the Nords down in place long enough for his forces to muster, or did Rainleaf lead them out of the ambush? That's essentially the narrative thread that you and your opponent are playing for. Regardless of if or how much they were slowed, the Nord forces are able to make it back to their boats. They're harried the entire way. Remember, that army was not supposed to kill them, just slow them. And as the Nords arrive at their boats, there is one issue that becomes immediately obvious to Rainleaf, and this is something I did not even think about until they dropped it, and I was like, oh man. When the Nords left the boats, they were moored at high tide. It is now low tide, so these boats are nowhere near the water. Which means that our Nord army, who is now being harassed and on the run trying to get out of there, is going to have to wait for the water to flow back in so that they can get out of here. So she does some quick mental math, and Rainleaf here is essentially, her plan is to take the army that she has, along with the forces that were left behind to guard the boats, and make a stand here and wait for the tide. Now, along with the boat defenders of Nords and stuff like that, there was actually a mountain Jotnar she left back there, which is pretty rad. And I totally get, for a moment I was like, well, why would they wait until this long to bring the named Jotnar? And then I was like, well, they were probably on somewhat of a soft stealth mission to not awaken the Old Dominion stuff, so I get not bringing the Jotnar on a stealth mission. Okay, you got me there. And at this moment, Rainleaf is thinking, okay, we're going to form a line. If we can push back the Old Dominion once, maybe twice, we can make a fighting retreat onto our boats, and the tide will come in by then, and we can be out of here with our MacGuffin in tow. But there's a problem with this. And it speaks to the core of the Nord system of authority. Gunnar One-Eye, the Jarl leading the majority of the military forces under Rainleaf, does not like this plan. Because Gunnar is doing a different kind of mental math, one that I talked about a little bit when discussing the Nords and how the Jarls kind of fit into things. He is a raiding warlord who makes his bones on hauling loot and surviving. He's looking and he sees that he and his boys, just from that first general casual walkthrough of the city, have already taken enough loot, treasures, and stuff like that to live like kings. And what the Old Dominion really wants is that creepy amber-looking egg thing that Rainleaf is all mad about, the Veil Siege. So, why not just give it to them? Try and appease them, maybe even put on a fake fight so they feel like they stole it or something like that, and then we just sail off and be rich. The deal was that we, get to loot all the stuff while Rainleaf gets this MacGuffin, but at this point in the story, we've got our reward, and that thing doesn't seem worth dying for, so let it go. Which actually makes a great deal of sense. And the two argue until eventually the Jarl challenges the Volva, and the two armies, or I guess I should say the one army, begins to fracture into two. And this is two very clear camps. Those following Gunnar, who think that we should ditch the Veil Siege and just, fight, of course, together until the boats arrive, and then we can just hopefully get out of here while they're all busy collecting their artifact. And then those on the side of Rainleaf who are like, well, we're stronger together, so obviously we shouldn't be dividing. And if we're rich enough to be like kings, and we have the whole reason we came here, it seems like if we just work together, we could all win. And Andronicus, if you don't know, has scouts. The Old Dominion does have a few. And he's watching these things happening, or at least hearing about them happening. And remember, in this setting, in Conquest, the undead are much more sentient than in other properties. At least the leaders are. Because Andronicus can remember what the Nords were like from his previous encounters with them. That they can be fractured and divided and then picked apart pretty easily. And so he's seeing this, and when the tensions really spike, that's when he attacks. When he starts to see the literal divide of parties like forming ranks against each other, that's when he's like, yep, this is when the ballroom blitz will commence. And so when he arrives, 3 forces have clearly been formed. Gunner One-Eye, Rainleaf Faithbringer, and Andronicus the Firebrand. Each one utterly convinced of their own righteousness. And this moment is our setup for Scenario 4. And I really want to take a moment to reflect on this because I feel like more than anything, this campaign book learned from previous ones. I criticized in the Sorcerer Kings and City States lore book because there was one mission where a random 100 Kingdoms army just appeared and then immediately disappeared. And I said, as much as I like the inclusion of 3-player or 3+ player missions, it was kind of the narrative execution that I didn't care for. And that's very different from this, in which I think they nailed the execution. It ends on a 3-player mission, but instead of a very random third party appearing, that third player takes part in this mix of treachery and warfare. And to be clear, this is a 3-player free-for-all. Gunner, Rainleaf, and Andronicus all have their own ways of scoring, and players can bid victory points to try and get the Gunner player on their side. But they're also incentivized to kill him. It's very cool. It's like a legitimately good 3-player mission. And the point values are adjusted as such to kind of account for this. But I'm just saying, in general, it just seems much more narratively relevant to have a third player come up and just kind of expand one of the forces rather than introducing a whole new army that had no business being there. And that acts as your final mission. Now, one thing I love about these Parabellum campaigns is the epilogues. There is a specific epilogue depending on which faction, the Nords or the Old Dominion. Now, in previous coverages, I have left these out because I don't want to spoil things. However, in those videos, there was an outpouring of polite requests for that exact content. So here is your spoiler warning. Stop now if you want to live in a world of mystery and intrigue, and continue if you want to be able to push your glasses all the way up to the top of your nose in a lore debate and say, actually. I jest. But here is the conclusions that we get. Like I said, spoiler warning. Let's start with the Nord victory, i.e. canonically what I want to have happened because I adore the Rainleaf mini and built an army around her. So in this story, the battle lines form up between our 3 forces, and Rainleaf Firebringer takes a beat to really observe and take in the battlefield. She is about to lose the Velsiege, an artifact that maybe would allow her to elevate mortals to the rank of Einherjar. And there was this brief moment of grief as she considered that. The idea that her people would be forced to continue revering dead gods forever and largely be leaderless and ununified was a terrible one. And at that moment, she was struck with a vision, one possibly projected by the Velsiege itself. A vision of a world where the gods walked among the Nords again. Einherjar of new and terrible forms that would kill anything who didn't kneel before them. Rainleaf's people walked among their deities again, and those deities stood in respect of her and her work, perhaps even elevating Rainleaf herself. Now that vision only lasted a second, but it snapped some real zeal into Rainleaf's head. She projected out a blast of magic that invigorated her troops and offset her enemies. Her Valkyries fought like lions and were able to essentially control the tide of battle. They weren't raffle stomping everybody, but they were able to kind of dictate where the forces were moving because they had the initiative. In doing so, Rainleaf was able to kind of position her forces over the fight towards the boats, meaning she put Gunner One-Eye between her and the Old Dominion army bearing down on them. By doing so, she had time to watch Gunner One-Eye die along with the rest of his traitorous men, and their deaths bought enough time for the tides to roll in, and Volva Rainleaf Faithbringer sailed home for a new and different kind of adventure, one that involves the future of her people. Interestingly, there's a side note here where she puts her hands on the amber case of the Velsiege, and a hand from inside mimics the jester, giving her vision. So it was an interesting scene. And as I said before, it reminds me of like a drone in a pod from the Spires just waiting to be activated, and her story ends there, which I think is a wonderful ending. Right, Gunnar gets his just desserts, the Nords reclaim a literal god-given artifact, their birthright and heritage, and while nothing's committed to in the lore, like an army of Einherjar or something, a new story branch is opened up for the Nords to explore, with good questions, like, hey, what if you could make your own gods? That's a heck of a topic. And then we have the alternative, so we'll pivot now over to the old Dominion side of things, if they had won. As I've said before, Andronicus Firebringer really is one of my favorite characters for how his personal story interweaves with the Nord specifically. And I think, in my opinion, he gets a fittingly awesome ending should he win. And so we'll rewind, right? We're watching the three armies form ranks, and the final battle begins and the clash ensues. And for Andronicus, a seasoned general observing this battle, this was a moment of both intense calculation, but also this kind of weird reminiscence, right? This was his foe. They fight just like the super fierce Nords from the old world when their gods walked among them. He was taken aback by just how unbroken they were as a people. Their spirit and their culture would survive intact for so long. And when I say it's like part reminiscence, he actually kind of has this moment of an anecdote from when he was a teenage human. At one point in his life, he saw this beautiful, like pure white stallion or something like that, but it could not be tamed. And so the people trying to tame it were like, what good is a horse if you can't break it in? And Andronicus sees the Nord people and culture as kind of in the same way. There's a fierce and noble beauty to them, but also they are so chaotic that they could never be a part of something grander, something bigger than themselves, which I thought was a wonderful synopsis for that. As he's kind of, wistfully thinking about this, it becomes clear that his plot to slow the Nords down has succeeded. Reinforcements from Iropetra arrived hourly, and the strength of the Nords was diminishing. While that Ice Witch, who originally disturbed his tomb, was able to get away on a boat and make it to sea, it really didn't matter. The Vale Siege was now his again, left here after one of the one-eyed Nords betrayed his kin. More importantly, though, and this is why I love this ending of the story, another treasure was left behind. The books and tomes that Rainleaf used to get here. The ones that detailed ancient magics and locations of where things have been. Remember, throughout this entire story, Andronicus Firebringer does not actually know what the Vale Siege is, or what this MacGuffin does. He knows he saw some pretty mind-blowing stuff inside of Yggdrasil before he went Super Saiyan and blew it all up, but in his mind, this is just a precious artifact. Very few of them exist, it's obviously beautiful, but it's just a relic. And the books that he found from Rainleaf leaving explain the purpose of it, elevating humans. Something about making them greater than their constituent parts. And from this, a dark idea begins to take root. What if, whatever this thing is and whatever technology it represents, could be applied to something that served the Old Dominion? There's more. Because in the book were stories about replanting Yggdrasil, the great tree. And Andronicus vaguely remembers the insides of that tree almost resembling a giant mind. Like it was almost like a huge computer almost. So what if he did that? What if he replanted Yggdrasil, but used that brain to graft to Haslia, the god of undeath? Can we start to repair our own god's mind from his madness? Like, these are a lot of really big ideas that start swirling around this dude's head, and there was nothing but potential in it. And for Andronicus the Firebringer, undead lord of the tomb city Iropetra, there was also nothing but time. Like I said, killer ending. I hadn't even considered him learning about what the MacGuffin actually does as its own reward, but yeah, he's a clever guy with experience in the divine. And so I want to end this series by asking the simple question, why is this stuff cool? And I have to say, as I said it before, this is my favorite of the Crucible of Will sets. From the way that the characters were intertwined in their history, the plot device for each side, the motivations for each battle were also super clear. Like, some narrative formats want to make each individual fight seem apocalyptic, but then when one side wins, you're like, so why is there a next battle? I thought we wiped them off the face of the universe. Right, if the stakes are so high, how do we keep it going? But I loved this campaign because the stakes and the scope of the fight was never in question. Can you get out of the throne room? Can Andronicus ambush the Nords to pin them in place? Will treachery spell disaster for anyone? Like, those kinds of things are very answerable questions in the game that we're about to play, and set up interesting moments in the next one without being oppressive. I think that the three-way battle, including 2 Nord forces versus 1 Old Dominion, was the best way to include a 3-player battle in this book. I adore it. If you wanted to make it a 4-player, you could also just have, I think it's Aklis as the named secondary leader from the Old Dominion, just to have him a force, you know, have the Old Dominion players be on the same team. You could easily open that up. But overall, I thought it was a wonderful execution of both a story and a huge win for the way that the rules represent those. So Parabellum, I thought you did a wonderful job. I'm stoked about this, and I would love to know your thoughts in the comments down below. What do you think of Rainleaf? Canonically, who do you want to have win? For me personally, I want Rainleaf to get out of there, and I want to see me some new Einherjar models. Show me something crazy. Thank you all so much for watching and listening, and I'll catch you in my next Conquest video. Happy wargaming, friends.